Welcome back. In this video, we're finally going to take a look at elements themselves and what we can do with them. So let's jump into VS Code. And here I have again a script that activates the calculator, gets its element and finds the number 5 button. So here we can already see two methods that we use from elements. The first is find element, which is a method of an element, because calculator element is a calculator window element, and we are calling the method from that element. So starting from this element, we are using find element. And the second one we are using is highlight, which is calling highlight on this number 5 button element and highlights it. First, let's take a look at the debugging methods we have available. So highlight is one of them. We can verify that we have the correct element. However, there's also dump. Dump simply outputs a string that describes the element. So in this case, we see that when we dump this button element, then we see the type is button, the name is 5, it has an automation ID of num5 button, and so on. So this can be useful if you already have an element and you want to get the information about it without using, for example, UIA viewer. You can also use dump all, which dumps both the element and all its descendants. So in this case, the output is the same because the 5 button doesn't have any children. However, if we dumped the calculator element instead, then we see that we get all the elements in the calculator window with the dump format. We can output it also to the console, so output debug, and then we get it here. It's easier to read this way and also copy. Or another way would be to assign it to a clipboard. And if I run it, then I can simply paste it somewhere and inspect it. So this is dump all. We can also specify a delimiter and the depth that it goes to. So by default, it prints the whole tree, but we could limit the depth, for example, to 3 layers or so. So in this case, it wouldn't go any further than 3 elements. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is properties. So if we wanted to output something about this 5 element, for example, we inspected it with the UIA viewer, and we wanted to get the name or the automation ID or any other property, then we could simply use that property like this. So here we see the name of the element is 5, or we could access automation ID and we get that also. We can also get the location of the element. So if I type location, then we see that it returns an object with x, y, width and height properties. So if I wanted to show the x and y coordinates of this element, the screen coordinates, then I can simply do this and it outputs the coordinates. Or I can move my mouse to those coordinates. But in this case, we need to think what the coordinate mode of the mouse currently is. And the default one is client. But the location returns screen coordinates. So we need to set this to coordinate mode mouse screen. And we see that it jumps to the top left corner of the number 5 button. If we didn't add this, then it would jump to the wrong location. However, we can also use client coordinates if we use the get position method. So get position, which by default gets the location with the same coordinate mode as coordinate mode mouse. So in this case, coordinate mode mouse is at the moment client. So the position will also be relative to the client. So we see that this works correctly. So if we use the location instead, then the first example looked something like this. However, this is a little bit bad to use because we are accessing the location property twice, and we don't want to usually do that in UIA. The reason is because if we call location, then first our script asks UIA that, hey, please give me the location for this element. And then UIA calls the calculator window and says, hey, I need the location for this element. Calculator window outputs it to UIA, and then UIA sends it to our script. That gets rather slow, all this communication. So it's better to instead do these kinds of calls just once. For example, I can fetch the location into this position variable, and from that get the x and y coordinates. And in this case, UIA will be calling the calculator window just once to get the location. This I also recommend doing if you're fetching a property multiple times. So if you needed to use the name property more than once, then it's better to assign it to a variable instead of accessing the property multiple times. So if we wanted to, we can also access pattern properties. So if I inspect the calculator window with UIA viewer, so the system menu item has the expand collapse pattern. So if we wanted to get the expand collapse state, then we can simply find that element. It was a system name, and type was menu item. So let's rename this to simply element, and we can get the expand collapse state. And we see that it returns 0 because it isn't expanded yet. So if we did expand it, we get 1. We can also explicitly say that we want the expand collapse patterns, expand collapse state, and use the same here. Expand, not expand. And we get the same result. So this is how we can get the expand collapse state. We can also, for example, get the toggle state, and property can also be assigned values. So we can, for example, change the value of a text box sometimes. Let's try to find this filter text box or edit element. This is in UIA viewer. The name is filter and the type is edit. So let's just check that we got the correct element, and we see that it's highlighted red. Let's try again. It's highlighted red. So if we wanted to, we can get the current value of the element, which is empty at the moment, but we can assign a value. So let's set it to text. And we see that the filter got set to text, and now the value is equal to text. We can sometimes also assign to pattern properties such as toggle state to change the toggle state to whichever one we want. So for example, we can check a checkbox by setting toggle state to 1. So if we wanted to see what properties are available, then we can go to the UIA wiki, and on the right hand side is chapter 4 elements. And if we click here, then we can browse all the properties or the methods and so on. So here we see that we have a bunch of properties we could access, and also there are patterns we can access and some methods. So first, let's talk about a few methods. For example, setFocus simply sets keyboard focus to the element. So if I used 5element.setFocus, then it focuses it. So if I press the enter or spacebar, then number 5 is already focused for the keyboard. The next is click, which is actually originally not part of UIA. So what click does is it tries to find click-like pattern, because UIA doesn't have a click method per se. For example, for buttons, UIA has the invoke method. So invoke means that only one thing can be done to the element. For example, a button can be clicked and nothing else. So invoke means click in this context. But for example, if we click the menu item, then that can do two different things. It can expand or collapse the menu depending on if the menu is already visible. So in this case, we have expand and collapse. I can expand this menu, and if we hold click on a menu item, then it would simply search that whether an invoke pattern is available and tries to invoke it. If it finds an expand collapse pattern, then it will try to expand or collapse it depending on whether the element is already expanded or collapsed, or a checkbox it might toggle, and so on. So as you can see, the click method will usually try to check for multiple things, and it's usually faster to simply use the pattern itself. So in this case, we can use the invoke pattern directly, which would do the same thing as click, only faster, a little bit faster. If we wanted to be very explicit that we want the invoke patterns invoke method, then we can also specify that this is from the invoke pattern, and it still works. This can be useful in, for example, a selection item pattern, where there is the select method, but also a legacy accessible pattern has a select method. So UIA wouldn't know which method to use unless you specify it. But usually calling simply select works. Okay, so next up, let's talk about the other arguments of click. As I said, if we simply leave click empty, then it uses an UIA method. However, if we specify the button, for example, click left, then it will instead use the mouse click function of auto hotkey. So it will move the mouse to the element and click it with the left button. Or we can right click the element and still it moves to the element and clicks it. This can be useful if an element doesn't have any UIA methods that allow to click it. So we can simply move the mouse to click. Or if we wanted to, for example, double click, then we can specify the click count. Or if the click count is higher than 10, then this will instead sleep 200 milliseconds after the click. So this is the same as doing this and sleep 200. So we can write less code like this. We can also click and specify 200, in which case it uses the UIA click method and then sleeps for 200 milliseconds. So the next one is control click, which is also an AHK method. So some elements don't have an UIA pattern available to click them, and we don't want to move the mouse, so we could use control click instead. However, unfortunately, in the calculator window, control click doesn't work. So we'd have to use some other window, for example, the UIA viewer. So let's make this not always on top, UIA viewer. And let's find the macro sidebar element, for example. And we need to set the match mode to substring to find it. Because in this case, it's either show macro sidebar or hide macro sidebar. So we can use substring macro sidebar to find this element. And if we control click it, then we see that that element is control clicked. And if we take a look at the argument list for control click, then the first ones are the normal AutoHotkey control click arguments like button and click count and options. However, the last one is win title. And if we specify win title, then this makes control click a little bit faster, because otherwise control click will need to get the window handle from the element, which usually is rather slow. So we can specify that the win title is UIA viewer, and then the control click should happen a little bit faster. And as in the case of AutoHotkey's native control click, if we add the NA or no activate option to control click, then it gets a little bit more reliable. So in this window, it was sometimes missing the control clicks, but now it is properly clicking it. Okay, so the next one is show context menu, which, if it works, shows the right-click context menu for the element as if the element were right-clicked, but often it doesn't work. Find and wait methods we're gonna take a look at in the next video, so we're gonna skip them for now. And then there are some property methods as well. For example, we can get the clickable point on the screen. So this simply returns X and Y coordinates for a clickable point in the element. Then there's the get window ID and get position, which we already saw. And these get property value and get pattern we don't have to use, because we can simply access the properties or the patterns by using invoke pattern. So these are just the same thing, only using methods. And we already took a look at highlight, dump, and dump all as well. So this is it for this video. And in the next one, we're gonna talk about all the find, wait, and tree walking methods. See you in the next one.